So recently, my partner manager, which I hope is okay to say, I hope it's okay to say that, my partner manager. But recently, my partner manager sent me in a question, and he recommended I do a video about it, discussing this. And the question at hand is he said, why do you think XXXTentacion's Posthumous, I hope I pronounced that correctly every time I try to pronounce Posthumous, I get like major anxiety. But he said, why do you think XXXTentacion's Posthumous album didn't get as much attention as Pop Smoke's or Juice WRLD's posthumous albums? Now, when he was referring to X's album, I don't really know if he was referring to Skins or Bad Vibes Forever or both. But he said album, album meaning, singular. So I'm going to say Bad Vibes Forever, especially since it's his, more recent posthumous album, right? Because if we look back, Skins was released back in 2018, while Bad Vibes Forever was released almost exactly a year after that in 2019. So for the sake of the topic at hand, we will be discussing Bad Vibes Forever as opposed to discussing Skins. So first off, we need to look at each album, and we need to see what spot they debuted at on the US Billboard. I'm going to specifically refer to the United States Billboard for each album. Now, if we look at Bad Vibes Forever, okay, it actually debuted at number 5. If we look at Legends Never Die, it debuted at number 1. If we look at Pop Smoke's Shoot for the Stars, Aim for the Moon, it also debuted at number 1. So clearly, there's a difference in performance between, both, Juice WRLD and Pop Smoke's album compared to X's album, right? If we look at both, Juice and Pop's album, right, both of them debuted at number 1, while X's album only debuted at number 5. And we got to take so many things into consideration. One thing that we can take into consideration is, the companies, how well they advertised. Something else we can take into consideration is the time of length between the albums dropping and, the artist's death, right? We got to take that into account as well. Something else that we can look into as well is, the features on the album. How many artists were featured on the album? How big were these artists? We can also take into account, hey, how much time was, X or Juice WRLD or Pop Smoke featured in the album itself? Were the verses put together good? Were the verses even completely finished? You just got to take so many things into account whenever you're looking into this. Now, something else we can also take into account, and I'll give a good example of this here in just a short moment, is we can take into account, hey, look, in between the time of the artist passing and the album dropping itself, was the artist featured on any notable tracks from, other major artists? And a great example of this was Juice WRLD. He was featured on Eminem's Godzilla, not long after his passing. I think it was roughly about a month, a little bit over a month maybe, after Juice's passing, right, Juice was featured on Eminem's Godzilla track. And Godzilla on Music to Be Murdered by Eminem is the most played track. Like, if you get on Spotify, you can see it is done far better than any other track that was dropped, that was released on the album. So the first thing at hand that I really want to bring up is the time of passing for each artist. Right, if we look at, each artist, if we look at the time, that it passed between these albums dropping and, sadly, their death, we can see that there is, if you look at X, he passed away back in June of 2018. If you look at his album Bad Vibes Forever, it dropped in December of 2019, okay? And if you look at Juice WRLD, he passed away December 2019. His album dropped July of 2020, okay? Then if we look at Pop Smoke, he passed away back in February of 2020, and his album also dropped in July of 2020. Now, I know I wasn't going to bring up Skins, or I said that I wasn't going to bring up Skins in this video, talk about it or whatever, but I want to bring it up for just this case, right? For this example, because I feel like it further proves the argument that time can definitely have, it can definitely play a major role in how well a posthumous album does, right? Because if we look at Skins, it was dropped in December of 2018, and, X passed away in June of 2018 as well. So in other words, the album Skins actually dropped roughly half a year after X's passing. And the album itself actually debuted at number 1 spot, on the US billboards. And then, taking that into account, if we look at Juice and Pop Smoke, right, Pop Smoke's album dropped not even a half a year after his death, and it debuted at number 1. And then Juice's, album dropped a little bit over half a year after his death, and it also debuted at number 1 spot. And then X's album Bad Vibes Forever dropped about a year and a half after his passing, and it debuted at number 5 spot. So I believe that definitely, kind of gives some proof or some evidence to show that, hey, the time between an artist, passing and, the time that, their posthumous album actually drops, time does play a role in how well the album itself will actually do. Now, something else that I mentioned earlier, right, that you can take into account is, did these companies advertise these albums well? Did they keep up with the hype? And to be totally honest, I don't want to say that they did or they didn't, because I kind of already knew about the albums prior to them dropping, or, I knew about them when they dropped, right? I mean, I guess you can say that they did advertise them well because I knew about them when they dropped, but I don't want to give a for sure answer to that, because I'm somebody who's really big into, listening to music, listening to rap and hip hop and stuff like that. I'm somebody who's really interested in listening to this kind of music. So I don't want to, for sure, I don't want to be like, yeah, they done good in terms of dropping the album, advertising, hype and all that stuff. They done great with that. I don't want to say that they did, because I'm somebody who's, somebody who tries to keep up with the news in terms of rap and hip hop and all of these artists. So I don't want to say that they did, but at the same time, I don't want to say that they didn't. Now, earlier, I also mentioned, how many features were on the album, who was featured on the album, and, looking over X's Bad Vibes Forever, there is a ton of features on the damn album. And I'll go ahead and I'll give you my straight up opinion on it. And the reason that I kind of feel like these albums done the way that they did was, a lot of these tracks that were dropped, especially on X's album, was kind of just half finished. And I'm specifically referring to X's part in all of these songs. All of these songs, all of X's verses on these songs were not, they weren't fully completed. And a lot of the songs just mainly featured nothing but, the featured artists on the album. So, the album Bad Vibes Forever itself, it didn't even really seem like a full-on X album. It just really just seemed like an album that not so much, other artists were featured on. It was just an album that he was featured on, because, the verses that were on the album, they weren't completed. But then we turn around and we look at Juice's album, specifically Juice's album that I want to bring up with this, not so much Pop Smoke's, because his album also features a lot of features. But I noticed, I feel like from the songs that I listened to anyways, that, his verses were, they were mainly completed and they were well done, compared to X's, album, all of his feet, you get the point. But if we look at Juice's album, there wasn't a lot of features on the album, and all of the verses were specifically done by Juice. Juice was the main artist on the album, not other artists that were featured on the album. That's kind of how it is with X. X didn't seem like the main artist on his own album, if that makes any sort of sense, because it was like, the majority of the tracks that was on the album was just other artists. But if we look at Juice, pretty much the whole album, not the whole album, but the majority of the album is Juice. A lot of the verses are Juice. But then, I guess we can, discuss features yet again, right? Even though the albums, even though Juice didn't have a lot of features on it, doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. And just because X's album has a lot of features on it also doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Because, if you have features on an album, and these albums, these artists that are featured on these albums are very popular artists, I mean, obviously that's going to bring some, recognition, that's going to bring more views to the album, right? If we look at X's Bad Vibes Forever, 3 of the most notable artists that at least I know of that are, on the album that I feel like are more mainstream is Trippie Redd, Lil Wayne, and Joyner. But now let's turn around and let's look at Pop Smoke's album, right? If we look over his album, we look at his features, we've got Quavo, we've got Lil Baby, DaBaby, Future, Roddy Ricch, 50 Cent. The list goes on from there. A lot of the features on the album are very big artists in the community at the moment, in the world at the moment. And if we look, if we go back and we look at X's album, a lot of the artists that are featured on it aren't, really well-known artists like the artists that are featured on, Pop Smoke's album. So, that could definitely also play a major role into how well the album itself does. Because obviously, if you have, very popular artists featured on an album, it's going to bring some attention to that album. Anyways, though, everybody, I'm pretty sure there's other factors that you can really look into, that you can really take into account on how well a Posthumous album, will do. Pretty sure there's other factors into it. But if you guys watched this far, thank you. Please smash like. It would be super greatly appreciated. Also, comment what you guys think about all of this down in the comment section below. That would also be super greatly appreciated. Anyways, guys, I love you guys. Stay beautiful. Do not go ugly on me. And I will see you all in the next one.